Preposterous, considering we saw the Challenger blow up while en route to space.
It's bigger than Nino Brown. This is big business. This is the American way.
It's kind of dark out. I do think despite of the light, this is a rough draft, but fuck it, the timing was right.
Eerily similar to that of the Challenger explosion. You couldn't make this up if you tried.
For most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go.
Less than 2 minutes after liftoff, the rocket speeding the shuttle at 2,000 miles an hour exploded. On the ground, spectators not certain of what they saw, and the understated explanation from NASA.
Obviously a major malfunction.
At first, there was hope a parachute falling from the debris was carrying all or some of the 7 men aboard. It wasn't. It was part of the Navy Air Sea Rescue Team. There is no escape hatch aboard this version of the shuttle. And later, space experts say no ejector seats or emergency evacuation capsule could have saved anyone from this disaster.
Reasons why this was not big news, and that is that the Space Shuttle Challenger, if you'll remember back to 1986, Space Shuttle Challenger exploded shortly after launch. I'm sure you remember that if you're of the age that you were alive, but even if you're not, it was a pretty big historical moment. I was in grade school at the time, and so what I didn't know is that it is fairly well assumed now that the astronauts survived the explosion, and I was a little skeptical about this, but I did some reading, and there are some reasons why it didn't make big news, and there are some reasons why people were a little skeptical about it, and I probably would have been one of those people, but I thought I would just try to give you the information that I have found here. Now, first of all, I will say it's funny because when you Google this, there isn't a lot of information out there. This is from the 80s. It's old history now, but it's kind of important history. But I think one of the big problems is, as far as I can tell, is that a lot of these initial stories are under conspiracy blogs, right? Like, one of the articles that I was reading that was talking about, what happened or why they think the astronauts survived, was labeled, was a story talking about the conspiracy about astronauts surviving Challenger. And now, I think even in the NASA community and the space community, it's fairly well assumed that they did. And I think the evidence is pretty strong. Like I said, it's probably not consequential. There was nothing we could do about it at the time, but I wanted to share with you what I understand happens. Now, as you might know, in '86, the Challenger was on the launch pad. There was a lot of freezing in Florida at that time. In fact, I think the orange groves were decimated, and so a lot of oranges were lost. It actually hit the orange market pretty badly. And but the O-rings around the solid rocket boosters shrank, cracked, broke, whatever, but I think shrank, and didn't create a proper seal. And so when those solid rocket boosters, the big white boosters on the sides of the space shuttle, were ignited, flame and fuel was leaking out one of the sides, and that was kind of a blowtorch on the main fuel tank. The big orange tank that sits in the middle is just fuel, and it was basically blowtorching that, and eventually, breached that. And what we saw then, a minute into that flight, or a minute and 13 seconds, I think, is that the Challenger explodes. And that is pretty much this picture. Now, I'm going to do this a little bit janky, and so I'm just going to show you some pictures of stuff that I've actually printed out. But what I assumed at that time is that when you see that big explosion, it's just a big puff of smoke. You see the solid rocket boosters fly out in all directions. My assumption is that just everything was incinerated at that time, that the astronauts were deceased at that point. And I get that for the sake of the astronauts that were on there, God rest their souls, and Krista McAuliffe was a teacher that was a big piece of this, and a big piece of the PR, and what made this flight interesting in many ways, that we don't want to reflect on people suffering and kind of anything that might be too hard to imagine, because this was a really tragic and shocking moment for a lot of people. And out of respect for the astronauts and the families that are dealing with the grief, I think that there was not a lot of follow-up news on it. So what ends up happening is the shuttle explodes, and you see a lot of contrails, or these smoke trails, as the debris is being shot away. Now, this is a screenshot that you can find this online. You can watch the video. There's a lot of actually slow-mo video filming it. But what here we have is one of the solid rocket booster contrails, I think, possibly, and then you have the crew cabin, and this is a very low res, quickly draft printed on my inkjet here, of the crew compartment in front of one of these contrails, which makes it stand out a little bit. Now, when I saw that and they slow it down in slow-mo, it definitely looks like you can see the shape of the nose cone and stuff. And as I was thinking about it, it makes sense why the crew compartment blew off. Now, I printed out this picture because I think it kind of illustrates what my point is here, is that just like every vehicle, and I've been into cars a long time, there are weak spots and strong points, and that is largely underneath all the things that you can see. And so here, what we can see in the space shuttle is that most of the space shuttle is meant as payload, right? It's this big vacuous container right here, and in this case, it's carrying satellites, and that's what it did. Skylab components, whatever, ISS components, and so it's meant as like a truck for space. Now, the really hard parts of this, my assumption, is where we have the rockets, which are used for liftoff, and then the crew compartment. And you can see it's almost kind of like, when you think of a car and you open the doors and you look at it from the side on, you'll see the engine bay is static and the trunk bay. But when you open car doors, that whole passenger compartment, because it's supposed to be space for people, is kind of the weak spot of the car. That's where cars twist and flex and they can break apart and things like that. And it's very similar on the space shuttle. Now, so when I heard that the crew compartment blew off, I thought, well, why just the crew compartment? Well, it makes sense to me that this is kind of a hardened structural piece here. Paresh, what's happening, brother? Or sister, glad to have you here. That when this is exposed to an explosion, it would probably break the middle, the weakest part, and these two pieces would probably fly off separately. And in fact, what we have now is footage of when that happened, right? So that this is being thrown away. And in fact, the last recorded piece of audio is after the explosion, a split second after the explosion, and I believe the captain says, "Uh-oh." So, and then the transmission is lost. So they weren't instantly incinerated. So that's one myth busted. Jericho, sup, man? Glad to have you here. So, all right. So now we know the crew cabin is being ejected. Now the question is, are they alive? Or were the G-forces, the accelerator forces, so much that they were crushed or killed or even incapacitated? It's possible. Although now I guess the estimate's saying that the accelerator forces were survivable. And we actually know that some of the rockets that are attached to crew portions of rockets that are meant to eject them, say like in a rocket that's sitting on a launch pad, can explode, and you might see they look kind of like antenna towers that stick off the nose cone. I think they had it on the Saturn V. There are rockets attached to it, and that is to draw off the crew module very quickly, so you can ignite that, and those are like 13, 14 Gs or something that you experience. So survivable. So the idea that they were able to survive the G-forces is possible. Some of them may have passed out, that no doubt about it, right? But what ends up happening now is the communications are cut off, and if the crew module is intact, it is a very high altitude. In fact, I want to say that I think the explosion happened around 45,000 feet, which is very, very high, and then they topped out at somewhere like 60,000 feet. So because of their trajectory, they are flying up. When it explodes, they're continuing to fly up, and they peak at 60,000 feet. So at this point, as I understand it, and I'm just giving you what I've read here, I'm not the expert on this, that at that altitude, you would only stay conscious for between 9 and 15 seconds because of the low oxygen environment. All right, so if they are awake for this period of time, they aren't going to be awake for long because of the lack of oxygen. Now, here's where some more evidence comes in. The astronauts actually have an emergency oxygen pack attached to them. Almost everyone, except for apparently 2 people. And what ends up happening is if the oxygen supply is cut off, they will start drawing out of the oxygen packs. Now, a couple of these people, and it's probably not super important, but Scobie is one of Scobie and Smith, I believe, are the only two that actually have to go to or attach or turn on their oxygen packs. Everyone else, assuming you run out of the onboard oxygen, you would automatically draw from these oxygen packs. But Scobie and Smith apparently could not do that. So I'm not sure exactly what the difference is there. But what ends up happening is that now for almost 2.5 minutes, it's almost mind-boggling because of that altitude. Even though the crew capsule is now descending at like 200 miles an hour, it takes them that long to get back to kind of denser air, that possibly the crew is awake. They're drawing oxygen because we know at least on 4 recovered oxygen packets, 3 of them are heavily used by the time the debris is recovered. And 1, which is by Scobie, is unused, but that's not a surprise given that he or she, I'm not actually sure, would probably not have had the opportunity to get their oxygen pack. So it appears, conscious or not, that the astronauts are actually breathing at some point before they hit the water. Now, unfortunately, they survived the explosion, and 2.5 minutes plus, the astronauts at that point perish. And I am not trying to undersell this at all. I actually remember the Challenger disaster. We weren't watching it in school, but there was a kid, and I think it was Jonathan Hoger, was running around my school at the time yelling, the shuttle exploded. And I didn't actually know what that meant. I wasn't actually sure what the shuttle was until I saw it later on TV in the evening news, and then I realized what it was. I wasn't getting when they were explaining this. Hey, Chesty, I appreciate this. Thanks, man. So it was a very moving moment for me too, and so I'm not trying to undersell this. And the astronauts that were lost, I totally get why this information was not, 1, all that relevant, and 2, protected and probably quarantined in some ways for the benefits of the families, because unbelievably tough time. And if you'll remember, I think the State of the Union by President Reagan was supposed to happen that night, and it was postponed. And so, because obviously he made a speech about the astronauts from the Oval Office, and I think a lot of people remember that because it was the one that ended with the quote, "and touched the face of God." And so it's one of those quoted speeches quite a bit. And I think the Aaron Copland Fanfare for the Common Man music is often played with that speech, and so you can go on, I'm assuming, YouTube and see it, and just a moving speech. He was quite the orator, and so that was, I just remember that. And I've always loved the NASA things, so we'll get into that a little bit more. I've got some more interesting trivia about the story. So unfortunately, that is probably the moment when they perish, and the crew compartment on impact of the water is heavily destroyed. And, there's not going to be, by the time they recover bodies and the debris, and it's strewn over the ocean, and as you can imagine, with the Malaysia Airlines and everything, once an impact with the ocean, finding debris, collecting it takes forever. And in fact, I have heard that even now, Challenger debris is still washing up on the shores of Florida, not necessarily in great quantities, but in fact I believe there was a very large piece that just recently was recovered. So despite the best recovery efforts, and where some of these are now in museums, I think there is still just a ton out there. So it was amazing to me that they were able to even find that crew capsule and put together the fact that the crew was probably alive, but not necessarily conscious, but we don't know that for sure. What I also think, there are a couple other interesting hero stories out of this, is that during the recovery of the crew, Gregory Jarvis, one of the crew members' body was actually kind of escaped from the wreckage as they were trying to bring it up, and the body floated away, and they tried to recover it, and they weren't able to do that, and the body sank, and it was kind of lost. Let's see here, I want to give everyone credit. A fellow astronaut, Robert Crippen, I think is how you pronounce his name, ended up, because he was determined not to end the recovery operations without retrieving Jarvis, rented a fishing boat on his own and went searching for the body. And on April 15th, near the end of the salvage operations, Navy divers found Jarvis. His body had settled to the sea floor 101 feet below the surface, and almost a mile from the resting place of the rest of the crew compartment. And so the body was recovered. So it's kind of amazing to me that you have people that, man, no man left behind kind of a situation to go through that effort. And so all the bodies were recovered. The condition of them obviously is kind of irrelevant and generally unknown. In one case, it sounds like a full casket was used for one of them. So one of the astronauts may have been in pretty good in whole condition, and so that's actually maybe kind of nice that they were able to do that. So as you'll remember, like I said, that was kind of a dark day in NASA's history, but it was just amazing to me to think that that astronauts were alive, because I'd actually seen there was a IMAX movie called I cannot remember, but it was about NASA, and they showed a sequence where NASA astronauts train to deploy this arm out of the crew compartment, attach like a carabiner, slide out, pull the ripcord, eject, basically, not eject, but evacuate the crew compartment. And I thought, man, that seems really hard. And especially if you're at speed tumbling, that's just no way to do it. And I know NASA, after the Challenger accident, even thought about putting in ejection seats. The space shuttle was probably not long for that, even though it continued to run. Here's my personal trivia about this, is that I really, like I said, really was enamored with the space shuttle idea. There was actually a thing called the Venture, which used a rocket spike engine or something like that to kind of be the next generation of space shuttle, and I was really excited about that. Venture Star or something like that, I can't remember exactly. Never ended up happening, and I was disappointed by that. But as a kid, I was so enamored with NASA that I got the chance, and I want to say it was about 2.5 years later, that NASA finally got the space shuttle program back going, and it was Discovery. It looks like September 29th, 1988. And I went down to Cape Canaveral to see that launch. It's the only spacecraft launch I've ever seen. I know that there are private companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin and some of these other, and NASA on top of that are still doing rocket launches. And I will tell you this, if you have the chance to go down and see a rocket launch, because I went down and saw the Discovery launch, it was amazing. It was amazing. You may have a job or a vocation that puts you in the midst of high-powered jets and rockets and things like that. But for me, it was awe-inspiring. The amount of noise and vibration. What's up, Jose? What's up, my man? That it puts out. And I think we were something like 5 miles away in the viewing area, was just absolutely incredible. It is loud and roaring. The shuttle that you're watching is like this big on the distance. It's on the horizon. But then once it goes, it is just, it's like almost unbelievable. Big Mac Sam, what's up, brother? Welcome. It is almost unbelievable that you've got this thing that is putting out these huge plumes, that it is shaking the ground like it is. It is really one of those things where you can't believe humans have been able to control so much violence and harness it for spaceflight. It's awe-inspiring, and I would bet that. Cool, man. Big Mac Sam, is something coming up that the NASA topic is interesting? I'm curious. Throw it in the comments and throw it in the chat. But it's just kind of really inspiring. So I bet any major rocket, anything that is taking something from sea level to space, has got to have a lot of power. So if you have the chance to see it, I would. So my hat's off to the people at NASA who were working on this. Navy SEAL, doctor, and then astronaut. Crazy dude, man. Johnny Kim. Got to hand it to these guys who put their lives on the line, for science and stuff like that, and it's pretty awesome. And I guess what I was most stunned by is the fact that once you see the explosion, in some ways you are, and I've seen the video a number of times since being a kid, is that you think you're so mortified by it. You're so mortified about what's going on, but you are maybe comforted in thinking, hey, it's over for those people. That what we like to think is that things are, people don't suffer, and life is kind of ties things up in a nice bow sometimes. And to think that for those helpless 2.5 minutes that crew might have still been alive was just something I had never even thought about. It never even entered my mind that they might have been able to survive that explosion, given how violent and how large it was. And so the fact that they did, and the fact that they would have met their end in a moment afterwards, and hopefully maybe were unconscious during it. but it's almost hard to comprehend. So I was engrossed by reading this, and like I said, it was some conspiracy theories. But then as I read more and more in recent years, people have come out and said, you know, this is what their professional opinion was about those astronauts. So that is my long story about the Space Shuttle Challenger astronauts surviving the initial explosion. Obviously, they did not survive at all. I think America came together at that moment. There were a number of Space Shuttle launches after that. It wasn't until really the Columbia disaster on re-entry that kind of put the final nail in the coffin for the shuttle program. And, you know, it's generally handled, space travel is generally handled a lot by the privateers now, so just kind of interesting. And now you can see those shuttles. If you want to see a shuttle, I've never seen one up close. I know there are a couple on the East Coast, I think one down in Houston, California. None made it to the Midwest, which I was mortified about too, because I think there's one of them is in New York and the other is in like Washington DC or something. So like there's two, I feel like, and someone can correct me on that, but I feel like there's two in the East Coast in close proximity, but there isn't a single one here in the Midwest for people to be able to drive through. I thought that was a big miss to not put one in Chicago or St. Louis or in Detroit or somewhere like that, or even Minneapolis, you know, a place where you can go and see it, because I certainly would love to do that. Now, the other piece of trivia here that I'm going to throw out is that you can check out my video history, is I actually have one of the silica space shuttle tiles that NASA created. It is generally just kind of like this ball of foam with this outer layer. I actually did a little bit of an unboxing. I was wrong about some of the details on it. It has suffered over the years, so it's kind of amazing because it is so fragile and it is kind of falling apart now. I think because that outer shell is dried off, and you know, and the foam now tends to start disintegrating and turning into powder. So I have it wrapped in plastic to try to protect it. It never flew, was never used on a shuttle. It was simply kind of an overrun production. All of the cells, or the foam cells that are used on shuttles, are printed on there with their location. There's like a numeric location that gets printed on it. Mine does not have it, or at least it's not there anymore, if it ever was meant to be used. But it's pretty big. I mean, it's kind of like this. And I bought it simply because I was just really interested. Now, you can buy little pieces of it. They sell little collectible pieces, so I think those tiles have been sold off in many cases, but it is so fragile. It's amazing to me that that is what was supposed to take the brunt of re-entry, that it's supposed to take like these air speeds of hundreds of miles an hour, thousands of miles an hour in some cases, and then just like a blowtorch like heat, because it seems so fragile and delicate, and it truly is. It really is. And so obviously that was part of the problem with the Columbia disaster, in that those tiles were damaged during takeoff and then not caught during flight to be able to repair. And I don't know that they could have repaired it. I mean, I don't know if you carry extra supplies in space and are able to do that. I know in subsequent shuttle missions they did do some minor repairs, removing some of the filler pieces and things like that came out and came loose during takeoff. So it's just really interesting. So I have one of those. You can check out that video. It's probably years old now, but it's still sitting in my closet. It's kind of a cool piece. I always thought it'd be awesome if it really was able to hold its shape and stay in really good condition. I'd put it in a glass box, but it's just not presentation worthy. But you can buy, people have bought them, and like I said, cut them up, put them on little collectible NASA cards and things like that. But they are really, really interesting. So anyway, that's just my take for today. Hope you're all doing well. You know, these are kinds of things that I like just going down the rabbit hole on sometimes and educating myself.
The Challenger crew was ready on the morning of January 27th, and according to NASA records, everything was going according to plan. Shuttle preparations began at 12:30 a.m., and after waking up at 5:07 a.m., the crew was strapped into their assigned positions in the shuttle at 7:56 a.m. About an hour later, Challenger's crew alerted control to a door ajar signal. The problem was with an exterior hatch. After the ground crew secured the door, they couldn't remove the exterior handle. The screws that held it in place were frozen. Over the course of 2 hours, ground crews struggled to remove the hatch handle with screwdrivers, a drill, and a hacksaw. And by the time they finally managed to get it off, the crew had been sitting in place for 5 hours and the launch window had passed.
I thought, gee, this is more like watching a rerun of the Three Stooges than launching a space shuttle.
Kennedy Shuttle Chief Bob Seek issued a statement saying, "It was just not our day. Our plan is to recycle and go for Tuesday morning."
Doors. I love it. All right, let's turn our attention back to the Challenger conspiracy. So we have people, mostly flat earthers, claiming the crew is alive and well, and apparently they've even kept their same names and are even working very public jobs. Now this sounds completely preposterous, considering we saw the Challenger blow up while en route to space. And if you don't know about it, basically the shuttle took off from Florida on a very cold day in January, and about 73 seconds into the mission, a booster engine failed and caused the Challenger to break apart. And I remember that day very well because I was in 8th grade and I was coming home from school and we saw it all over the TV. It was being played over and over again. So fast forward 30 years and this idea begins to take shape that the crew is still alive. And of course this presumes the crew never actually boarded the Challenger the day it took off. And if this statement is true, then it adds further proof that NASA is faking space. Because most of us know about the air bubbles seen in astronauts' helmets in space, the harnesses and wires used to hold them up and make it look like they're in 0G, and of course, the fake moon landing missions. Whether outer space exists or not, we may never know for sure, but even if we could hypothetically and definitively prove without a doubt that NASA is faking space, it doesn't necessarily confirm that the Earth is flat. It just makes the likelihood more probable. So let's look at the 7 Challenger crew members and see if we can justify the claim of them being still alive. The first crew member I'll bring up is the commander Richard Scobie. Now take a look at this picture. Here's the commander on the left, and he was born in 1939 and would have been 46 years old at the time of the disaster. And this gentleman on the left has the same name, but dropped the Francis off the beginning. He's around 75 years old, which is the age the commander would have been at the time of this photo. Now look at the similarity in their appearance. Do you think they're the same person? I can see some similarities in the face, but to me this is not conclusive proof, but it really makes you think. The second crew member to talk about is Judith Resnick, and hers is a little bit more interesting. She was a mission specialist and veteran astronaut, and her doppelganger is a Yale law professor also named Judith Resnick. And of course, if the astronaut Resnick was alive at the time of this photograph, she'd be about the same age as the law professor. And you can see right there's an uncanny resemblance. Same dark curly hair, dark eyes, same eyebrow shape, same lines on both sides of the face extending up from the jaw, and even their mannerisms appear to be the same. How do you explain that? The third crew member is the pilot Michael Smith. That's a very common name. Look at the two faces. I could see this being the same person aged 30 years up. But I can also see it as a coincidence, especially because the name is so common, which is not the case for Commander Scobie and Judith Resnick. The fourth crew member is payload specialist Gregory Jarvis, who is never talked about in this conspiracy. Apparently, no doppelganger could be found, so we'll just skip over him. The fifth and sixth crew members are Ronald McNair and Ellison Onizuka, and both pictures look like they can definitely be the deceased astronauts. However, we're told that both of the older men that we're seeing in the pictures are actually their twin brothers. And I tried to do a bit of research, but it's difficult to substantiate. I did listen to an interview, however, with Ronald McNair's brother, Carl, so I presume it's possible. And the seventh and last crew member is Sharon Christa McAuliffe, and she was going to be the first teacher in space. And this picture shows her supposed doppelganger. Now to me, I just don't see a strong resemblance here, but again, this woman is around the same age as Christa McAuliffe and has the same name. And that's because Christa's first name was actually Sharon, but she went by her middle name. All right, let's weigh up the facts and see if we can make a determination if these people are really the same space shuttle crew members or not. And as I said before, the chances of Richard Scobie and Judith Resnick having a doppelganger of the same age and name would be extremely rare, probably 1 in millions. And what's most interesting is that Resnick, the Yale law professor, is quite a public figure and has been on C-SPAN. And surely these people have friends and family who know if they were truly the astronauts from the Challenger or totally separate people. And the pilot Michael Smith looks very similar to the older photo, but because his name is so common, we can't really put any odds on it. Now, in regard to Ronald McNair and Ellison Onizuka, the chances of having an identical twin is roughly 1 in 250. So if my math is correct, the chances of having 2 identical twins out of a 7-person crew is 1 in 875. Now, math wasn't my strong suit, so that could be wrong. Not the best odds, but certainly attainable. And as for Christa McAuliffe, I don't buy that's her in the picture, and Gregory Jarvis is a non-factor as there's just no picture of him. At best, I would say there's a slim chance that we're looking at the same people. But I wouldn't put it past NASA either, because we know they've been caught faking space recently and during the moon missions, so why not in the middle periods of the 1980s as well? Interestingly, the shuttle is supposed to be a glider, but I've seen footage that shows it's actually an airplane and has jets, and I wish I could find that clip. I believe I saw it in a presentation by a guy named Darren Nesbitt, who you can see on YouTube. He does presentations on Flat Earth and NASA conspiracies. Anyway, that's my prognosis of the Space Shuttle Challenger conspiracy. What do you guys think? Are these the same people, or do you think it's total BS? I'd like to know. Now, I want to move on to talk about Elon Musk. In my video with Dave Weiss last week, he mentioned he'd send me a link to a video that exposes Elon Musk as a fraud, and he promptly did so right after the interview. So I posted the link in the description of our interview, and I've watched the Elon Musk video several times myself. I'm not sure if any of you watched it, but personally, I don't buy into anything SpaceX is doing, and I certainly don't believe Elon Musk is the super genius everyone thinks he is. How could he possibly run SpaceX and Tesla and live the life of a celebrity at the same time? I don't see it. So the video was brief, only about 5 minutes long, but it was good, and it basically refutes a lot of the commonly held beliefs about Musk, many of which were put forth by Musk himself. And one is that he was born poor and was extremely hard up in college. But the video claims Musk's family was super wealthy, and they even owned an emerald mine. And he had plenty of money as a child, a college student, and afterwards. And it's also a common belief that Musk was the founder of PayPal and Tesla, but he wasn't. He was with PayPal before the company had that name, but he performed so poorly as the CEO, the company actually fired him when he went on vacation. As for Tesla, 2 men founded the company before Musk had any part of it, and after Musk invested in the company, he then forced one of the founders, a man named Martin Eberhard, out of his position as CEO and took over that position. And Musk then rewrote the company history to make it appear he was the founder. Now, the last piece of intriguing information from that video involves Wernher von Braun, who was the head of NASA and a former German scientist during World War II. And interestingly, he wrote a novel around the year 1952 that predicted a man named Elon would conquer Mars. And that's very odd because NASA has partnered with SpaceX to colonize Mars. Is this just a coincidence, or is there something more behind it? Remember, the deep state plans things out decades in advance. And now for the last thing that I want to talk about, which is my conversation with the producer of the TV show. Many of you know I was contacted recently by a major network television show looking to do a 1-hour documentary entirely on me. And many of you suggested I skip the show, and for good reason. Well, I got a text from the producer late last night asking if I could talk to his higher-up, the woman who's in charge of the whole project, and she's the executive producer, the big cheese, so to speak. And I agreed because I wanted to hear what she had to say. So we talked for over a half hour, and mostly it was her talking, trying to convince me to do the show. And she asked what the main obstacles were for me, and I told her it was asking me to fabricate conflict and to see a therapist. And I guess they really want me because she came up with a new angle. And this time it's I'm a loner who has beliefs of simulation theory, but other than my
It's a whole, it look like a whole road above that path. A whole path.
Yeah, it's the path to heaven to take your ass, motherfucker.
The lines in the background ain't moving.
I'm hungry.
Me too.
I hate calling 49 deli. These bitches never pick up.
They ain't open yet, bro.
They're not?
At 8 o'clock it is.
Man, fuck the charge up, man. This nigga gonna take a picture. I need a drink.
Motherfucking Keon.
Call me. It's 5 o'clock somewhere.
He's funny as shit. He said it's 5 o'clock somewhere. The background clouds ain't moving. Or whatever they are. They ain't going nowhere.
You guys like to place order, please?
We just ordered. Nothing is ready yet.
Alright. Gotta call the old diner. Hey Siri, call the Selma old diner. I ain't saying nothing about no motherfucking no.